So in this video, we'll look at what happens to the revolutionary government in France after the Reign of Terror. So we'll just call this after the Reign of Terror. And after Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety are liquidated, gotten rid of, executed, we get a new constitution. I think this is our third one. And this is called the Constitution of Year 3. Because we're still using that weird revolutionary calendar. So we get a new constitution. And what this does is it creates the government that's going to take us up through Napoleon. And so we get a government with a 2-house legislature. And an executive body called the Directory. And that's what this period of time in France is known as the Directory. So the Directory is made up of 5 members. And every year, one is randomly selected to step down. And the point of this was to prevent a person from dominating the Directory like Robespierre did. So every year, one of the members of the Directory is randomly selected to step down, and the legislature elects a new member. Now, this system was more stable. I mean, it's obviously going to be more stable than a government that is run through political executions. But it did have its problems. So it had to fight off an attempted Jacobin coup. A Jacobin / sans-culotte coup, which they were successful. And they also had to fight off an attempted royalist coup. So they had to fight off a coup from the left and a coup from the right. This second coup had the Directory defended by Napoleon. And this is where Napoleon kind of becomes the personal defender of the Directory. Now, this highlights an important thing about the Directory in that they don't really reflect anyone's positions. They're not a left organization, they're not a right organization, so they don't really have a base of power in France. So no one is really standing up to defend them. Really, only the military protects them. So what you get is a group of people who are defending a very, very narrow set of interests. You know, if you think about what Robespierre and the other Jacobins were doing, at least they had a big base of support. They had the poor working people of Paris who were supporting them. But once we got done with them, we definitely didn't want to have the king come back. So there really wasn't a large enough base of support for the Directory. And so the only people that supported the Directory were the military. And that was because they were ordered to protect the Directory. So eventually, members of the Directory, including the Abbé CS, who, if you remember back to the very beginning of the French Revolution, he's the one that wrote What is the Third Estate? He managed to survive all of the revolutionary terror, and he was elected to the Directory. So members of the Directory conspired with Napoleon himself to overthrow the Directory. So the Directory conspires to overthrow itself and kind of create a kind of dictatorship. It wasn't called a dictatorship, but that's essentially what it turns out to be. Led by CS and Napoleon. And Napoleon eventually kind of pushes CS out. So this coup is called the Coup of 18 Brumaire, when Napoleon kind of overthrows the Directory. Now, 18 Brumaire on that weird calendar is in December of 1799. The title Napoleon takes after the coup is First Consul, but he's the one that's in charge. And eventually, in 1802, Napoleon names himself Emperor of France. So he is now Napoleon the First. So what we're going to look at now are Napoleon's domestic policies. Napoleon is much more famous for his military strategies, and we're going to spend probably the last two videos here on the French Revolutionary period looking at Napoleon's foreign policy and his military strategies. But what we're going to look at here are Napoleon's domestic policies. And if we kind of summarize this, he's basically running France as a corrupt, enlightened, absolute monarch. Enlightened, absolute monarch. That's kind of what Napoleon's thing is. He's a corrupt but enlightened absolute monarch. So we're going to see a combination of policies from the Ancien regime, so the period before the revolution. We're going to see some revolutionary policies. And we're going to see some stuff from the Directory. So Napoleon is going to kind of pick and choose the stuff from Louis, from the National Assembly and the Legislative Assembly and the National Convention, and stuff from the Directory that personally benefits him. So remember that throughout all of this, France is still at war. France was at war pretty much constantly from 1792 all the way up to Napoleon's final defeat in 1815. The other thing you've got to keep in mind about this is that despite everyone else in Europe kind of conspiring against Napoleon, the people of France viewed Napoleon as their savior, as their hero. And they still view him that way. So keep that in mind as we think about some of Napoleon's domestic policies. So he makes a big deal of participatory government. There are lots of elections and what are called plebiscites. A plebiscite is basically where the government asks the people a question. So there were lots of elections and there were lots of plebiscites where the government basically asked the people a question, and the question was usually, do you like Napoleon and his leadership? That was usually the question that was asked in these plebiscites, and it was always overwhelmingly yes. The people always approved of Napoleon and his leadership. Now, Napoleon was also kind of an early adopter of public opinion. And he was pretty good at manipulating public opinion. So before one of these plebiscites, Napoleon staged an assassination attempt. He caused it. Nobody got hurt, but it certainly looked like the Jacobins or the Royalists were trying to kill him. And so that made people sympathetic to him. So Napoleon becomes sympathetic. So in doing this, he's connecting himself to the stuff that the revolution was doing. But at the same time, he's ruling France as a monarch. So he's kind of picking and choosing stuff that suits Napoleon. Another thing that he did domestically is that he made peace with the church. And he signs a treaty with the Pope. And a treaty with the Pope is called a concordat. And this is the Concordat of 1801. So he signs this treaty with the Pope, and these treaties with the Pope are called concordats. And so he signs this treaty with the Pope, basically burying the hatchet. Napoleon wants to be seen as a friend of religion. Most of the people of France were opposed to the radical de-Christianization. So most people didn't like all this crazy de-Christianization stuff, and under Napoleon, they stopped using that calendar. So Napoleon wants to be seen as somebody who's not opposed to religion. Most people in France are Catholic, so he makes peace with the church. The Vatican regains control of the appointment of French bishops, which had been a power of the French monarch for centuries. And in return, the Pope recognizes Napoleon's leadership. Like, you are the guy in charge of France. But on top of this, Napoleon legalizes religious tolerance. Now, this is, a big Enlightenment idea. This is Voltaire's thing, is religious tolerance. And Napoleon legalizes it. Whatever religion you want to do, we don't care. Religion is completely up to you now. Protestants were allowed in the government. So Napoleon had ministers of the government who were Protestants. This is a piece of evidence that shows something Napoleon does all the time. Napoleon himself was a-religious. He didn't really care about religion. He used it as a tool to help gain popular support. So, as Emperor of France, Napoleon was a Catholic. In our next video, we'll talk about Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt. In Egypt, Napoleon claimed to be a Muslim. He wasn't, but to the people of Egypt, it made it easier for Napoleon to do his job if the people believed he was a Muslim. So he's using religion as a tool to get people to support him. It also takes away something that his opponents could use against him. Because you could make a very good argument that Napoleon was not religious, and that's a reason we should get rid of him. But you can't say that he's not religious when the Pope himself approves of Napoleon. So he's a very shrewd user of popular opinion and of religion. He uses religion as a tool. He's also going to codify a lot of the revolutionary advances. So we're going to put down permanently some of the social changes we made as a result of the revolution. So we're going to formally eliminate the feudal system and the estates and all the privileges of the nobility. In other words, everyone will pay taxes. We're basically getting rid of the nobility, and everyone is going to pay taxes. We're going to have a bureaucracy of merit. So it's no longer who you know or who your family is. Education becomes the sign of social standing. Now, that still benefits the wealthy because they're the ones who can afford to go to school or afford to have their children go to school and not work. It still benefits the wealthy, but it does kind of give an equality of opportunity. If you can get to school, then you can advance in French society. On the other hand, though, we're going to take back a lot of the gains women made. So maybe to placate the church, divorce is made illegal again. But I think that if you were already divorced, you could remain divorced. All of this stuff is kind of codified into what becomes known as the Napoleonic Code. So there are many important legal codes. We had Hammurabi's Code, we have Justinian's Code, and now we have Napoleon's Code, the Napoleonic Code. And as Napoleon starts to conquer the rest of Europe, this is going to be exported to a lot of other European countries. So as we kind of segue into Napoleon's foreign policy, France's laws will influence the rest of Europe. And France's nationalism, the thing that drives their military, will also be exported. So in our next set of videos, we'll look at France's foreign policy. We've kind of been trying to keep the French Revolution isolated to France, but this has not been happening in a vacuum, and all of this stuff has been under the kind of weight of almost constant warfare. And so what we'll do on our next video, and probably the next two videos, is kind of circle back to the beginning of these wars and look at how the invention of French nationalism influences the military, and how Napoleon is going to use that to conquer France. And eventually that will be Napoleon's final undoing, but we'll worry about that in our next set of videos. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.